first, we have James Hughes, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's a bioethicist and sociologist at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, where he teaches health policy and serves as the Director of the Institutional Research and Planning.
So, one of the first things I usually do in these kinds of debates is try to set an historical and sociological context to normalize the topic, the emerging technology question. And in this case, I think the conference so far has set a good tone, that really what we're talking about is civilization itself, the way in which our brain has learned to be a social animal. I've been very influenced recently, I should have read him a long time ago, but I read recently Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. It's very influenced by his kind of sociologically informed notion of what the virtues are. I understand it's evolved since then, but the notion that virtues are ways that societies have come up with formalizing this particular social skills that they try to encourage people to have. And I think what we've seen from the neuroscience literature so far is that that's a complex interplay of the training and the conscious, rational training of various kinds of faculties, social skills, and inclinations, vis-a-vis our monkey brain moral sentiments and inclinations. But I think that's the place to start, is that what we're talking about is the continuation of the project of civilization itself. And when I look back at our history, I think that it's very clear that as soon as human beings began to notice the effects of food and drugs on their behavior, they began to come up with ideas about ways that food and drugs might contribute to the project of enculturation and complement the moral and social training that they were trying to give themselves. Shamanic use of entheogens is one that we don't know so much about because it's not part of recorded history, but I think a more approximate example is Ayurvedic vegetarianism, the notion that in Ayurvedic medicine that eating meat, or conversely having a vegetarian diet would lead to a more spiritual way of life, and have a calmer, purer personality. Certainly in Chinese medicine, there are different kinds of herbs and medicines and meditational exercises prescribed for different kinds of moral failings. The moral benefits of fasting have been advocated in many different cultures. And then conversely, the moral problem of taking drugs and intoxicants has been noted widely. And I think that this notion that we don't include, we shouldn't see as part of the question of moral enhancement, the exclusion of certain kinds of chemicals as a part of the continuum of whether we should be including others. That's one of the arguments that they make. I also want to make the argument that the largest context of moral enhancement is not simply the question of the chemical or genetic or possibly nanotechnological enhancement of the brain, but it's that we have the hardware of the brain and the software of the brain, and there are things internal and external. So when it comes to external, I think of moral gadgets. I've been, for years, trying to control my weight by keeping a food diary. It's not a very effective moral gadget because it requires a great act of will and to actually do it really honestly. But hopefully someday I'll have something which takes pictures of my food and tells me when I've reached my 1,800 calories a day, or monitors my blood sugar and is able to turn off my stomach's appetite at the appropriate moment. But the notion that we're only trying to change structures of the brain and neurochemistry, I think, is too limited a perspective of what the broader moral enhancement technology question is. And just recently there was a study of the effects of wearing white lab coats on enhancing attention. And there's a lot of research on what's called embodied or enclosed cognition, the ways that clothes affect our moral behavior and mind. And other examples might be sobriety locks on cars, or email language triggers when you try to use a curse word in your email, and it flags it and says you really want to say this to somebody. There are many ways in which our exocortex can be enlisted as a part of our moral enhancement. So this question of the continuum or the status quo bias that we have that says, well, suppressing vice is okay, but enhancing virtue, that would be problematic. I think this is one of the things we have to interrogate. Research has shown that a kid with ADD as a driver is as dangerous as a drunk driver, an untreated kid. We know that fatigue and cell phone use are some of the causes of car accidents. And so we have these external systems and structures and norms, driving laws and norms which affect car accidents and how many cops we have on the road. We have our behavior whether we don't take alcohol. But then we also have this question, should we, under certain circumstances, take stimulants when it's obvious that stimulants, certainly for people with ADD, perhaps for a much broader population, reduce the rate of accidents that we have? Why don't we have a moral obligation to take modafinil or some other kind of drug if you're an airline pilot or if you're a late-night trucker, and you know that your accident rate would in fact go down if you took these kinds of drugs? I was diagnosed as a kid with ADD and was in special ed and took Ritalin. And when I would get in trouble after that diagnosis, the first question my mother would ask me is, have you taken your pill? My first moral responsibility every day was to take the pill that would put on my plate. So I think one of the ways to think about the question of responsibility, although there's a great deal of concern in neuroethics literature and more broadly conservative commentators who say this effort to explain human behavior or to identify the neural mechanisms of human behavior, this is just another liberal effort to reduce individual responsibility, to explain away people's moral behavior as a cause of tumors or neurochemistry. I see moral technology or moral enhancement as the antidote to that. It really provides this greater moral responsibility. We have the decisions. It becomes, of course, quite complicated if we begin to change our own identity and our own sense of volition with these technologies. But part of the question here is, do you want to be the kind of person who consciously wills yourself in a different moral direction or not? And these technologies actually provide us with some kind of tangible way to do that. And of course, this is an ancient question about the way in which using technically, in this case, just rope, but what would be wax, I guess, putting wax in the ears of the freeform code. But whether willing yourself, binding yourself somehow, in this case of moral enhancement technology, binding your brain so that it doesn't do certain kinds of behaviors and does do others, is in fact an act of will over time. I know in the morning I'm going to want to smoke in the afternoon, so I crush my pack of cigarettes so that I don't smoke in the afternoon. That was in fact what I did for years when I was drinking and smoking. Now I think the whole project of enhancement technology, yes, fasting. I mentioned the tryptophan thing because I thought it was fascinating that the tryptophan may in fact indicate that vegetarians are less nice people, at least temporarily, until their brains adapt, and then the Ayurvedic medicine may have had it completely wrong. So part of the project here is that we want to figure out how science actually informs our project of enhancement. This is Benjamin Franklin to Joseph Priestley. He says, it's impossible to imagine the height to which it may be carried in 1,000 years of power of man over matter. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured, and lives limited with pleasure. Oh, that moral science were in a spare way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another, and that human beings would at length learn what they now properly call humanity. I think if you go back to those Enlightenment era thinkers, when they had this bloom of enthusiasm about science and technological empowerment, he actually makes quite a nice shout out here for wine, Benjamin Franklin also. Fewer tensions and more tolerance. That they had this notion that the type of technology would eventually conquer moral science, that we would be able to improve moral character in ways more efficacious, like in prisons and flogging. I think there's also a very interesting connection between stimulant medication and the Enlightenment, and recent historiography about the role of coffee houses and the difference between coffee houses and ale houses in terms of encouraging Enlightenment thought. And recent research has shown that caffeine makes it more likely for people to want to change their minds. It apparently encourages a little bit of the personality trait of open-mindedness. And here, in 1674, a poet said, "Beer was foggy ale, besieged our brains, but coffee was that grave and wholesome liquor that fuels the stomach, makes the genius quicker, relieves the memory, revives the sad, cheers the spirits without making mad." It may in fact be that part of what we owe to the Enlightenment and what the Enlightenment owes in terms of coffee is this interaction effect between moral enhancement effects of stimulant medication. Now I want to quickly turn from the Enlightenment to John Haidt, because I've been, and yesterday's talk did nothing to allay my anxieties about his, the way that he spins this particular analysis that he's been doing. And his chart is a little bit different than one we showed yesterday than this one that I caught from him earlier. But the analysis that he makes, I think, is problematic from my perspective, because I see the Enlightenment as precisely the point at which moral reasoning began to say there are certain moral sentiments that we have which are consistent with moral reasoning and others which are not. And part of the civil rising process that Pinker has pointed to and others has been the capacity of human beings to transcend these monkey brain moral instincts and to use rational faculties to shape and suppress immoral sentiments. I think John holds a brief, and I respect the argument from a sociological perspective that the moral sentiments may have certain sociological utility. But I see the process of Enlightenment civilization as equally worthy of support. And what I find very problematic is the notion of the kind of moral relativism that I see being encouraged. I point, for instance, to the recent study that propranolol suppresses racism, partly by suppressing these amygdala responses that people have to the other. As an example of how moral enhancement might in fact be used to further the project of rational tolerance, universality, as respect for diversity and so forth. So the encouragement, the discouragement of irrational sentiments, I think, is a part of the project of moral enhancement, and the encouragement of shaping of moral sentiments, the innate sentiments that we have in moral direction. As we've heard already in the conference, fairness is not, fairness may be an innate instinct, but it's not at all clear how it should be expressed, what in particular, who we should be fair towards, who is an exploiter, who isn't exploited, who should we care for, what kinds of empathy should we have, and in what kinds of situations. So part of the project of moral enhancement, as Molly pointed out yesterday, has to be the enhancement of discriminating wisdom. And so we can't separate the question of the encouragement or suppression of particular innate sentiments from the encouragement and enhancement of our cognitive faculties, memory, knowledge, cognitive speed, the discriminating wisdom of various kinds. We know that telling truth in all circumstances is not, in fact, a moral virtue. And in fact, from Aristotle on, no one has really argued that virtues are virtues in every circumstance. We need that capacity for discriminating wisdom, so cognitive enhancement has to be a part of this picture. Now, another complaint that people often have when we talk about this project of cognitive enhancement, or especially moral enhancement, is the complaint that this is going to lead inexorably to a restriction of cognitive liberty. Once we start having a notion, I've argued that liberals need a notion of the positive human personality, that we need to re-grapple with these Aristotelian questions. We can't simply say it's fine to live your life on that with other, as libertarians would. And then once you start to get into that domain, you're immediately going to be down the road to a brave new world or some kind of totalitarian nightmare. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that the slippery slope argument of that these kinds of technologies would lead us in a bad direction is wrong, because social norms and the boundaries between criminality, the behavior, criminality, and insane behavior, have always been changing and been redrawn. And these technologies will have an effect on them. It will raise the standard of certain kinds of moral behavior. It will increase the willingness of people to disclose what kinds of moral technologies they're using. You may want to vote for one candidate because they're using one kind of moral technology versus another. So I don't think that they challenge cognitive liberty in a fundamental way, but I think we do need to grapple with them. We need to, for instance, the example of rape, I think is moral progress that we have gone from Leviticus, where you could marry the woman that you raped, or from societies where castration or murder of the rapist was the expected punishment, to prison. But I think it's even further moral progress to have chemical castration, testosterone suppression, as a therapeutic, as a criminal justice modality. People, the ACLU, others, have been concerned about this as a violation of civil liberty as cognitive liberty. There's certainly a question here about under what circumstances, what kinds of pressures, what kinds of quid pro quos within a criminal justice system should we allow for to say to someone, you have to use a particular moral enhancement technology that will reduce your recidivism rate, your criminal intention. But I don't think that this is a terribly novel question, and I don't think it's impossible for us to come up with the kind of safeguards that we need. Similarly, I don't think that saying certain kinds of children's behavior is callous and uncaring, and therefore needs a particular kind of chemical treatment or moral enhancement treatment is something that we can't figure out how to do in a just and livable way. So, if I had more time, I would illuminate these topics, but I'll just briefly point to them. And I'd say there's a number of ways in which I think we need to interrogate the ways in which cognitive enhancement, moral enhancement, many emerging technologies challenge cognitive liberty, but in a number of dimensions. One is the question of lack of privacy. The neuroethics literature has been concerned for a while about the question of lie detection and brain fingerprinting and those kinds of things. And those, of course, were also implicit in the question of our moral faculties. If we were to come up with a technology that enabled, through some combination of brain scans and finger polygraph tests or whatever, to figure out whether people were lying, moral, compassionate, whatever, how would those be used and what rights would you have to disclose or withhold that kind of information. The question of overt control, I often say to people, you may have seen Clockwork Orange and come away with the impression that this was somehow sympathetic, but I think if you actually knew someone like the character in Clockwork Orange, you would not at all be sympathetic with their complaint that they had been subject to a therapy which made them incapable of committing acts of violence. Now, that's one extreme, but on the other hand, we have Soviet psychiatry as a historical example where people, because of thought crime, were subject to electric shock and chemical treatment and various kinds of overt control. And so we have to figure out what the difference is between Clockwork Orange and Soviet psychiatry. Ownership, I think, is an interesting one and hasn't been grappled with much yet. But I think there's a continuity between the arguments that we're having about intellectual property overreach in whether you videotaping this particular event is a part of your own right to record and possess your own experience, or is it a violation of the intellectual property rights of NYU or something else? If you were to wear glasses that had recording technology and watch a movie, would you be able to record the fact that you had this experience, or is that a violation of intellectual property? I have on my laptop Google Desktop, and it records every email and every particular document that I use on my desktop, and I love the particular software. I have no idea where the information goes, how it's used, who has access to it, and I'm not terribly concerned about it, but probably I should be, because it is now part of my exocortex. It's part of the way that my brain works. So I think this question of ownership is an interrogation. Social norms, the example I give here often is transgender culture or transgender identity. Right now, it takes a year, 50 grand to, if you're a male, female, transsexual, to convince a psychiatrist to go through the therapeutic process, have the surgeries. But eventually, if we were to have this magical pill, that you go to the doctor and say, I think I'm a woman in a man's body. Here's a pill that will make you feel like you're a woman in a man's body, a man in a man's body. Would you rather do that or spend the year on 50 grand? I think a lot of people would choose to do the former, and I don't know that we're all comfortable with the notion of diversity being subject so easily to conformity to social norms. I think, I prefer individual choice, so I think I would, in fact, argue for that, even if it meant a little bit less non-conformist behavior. Addiction, I'm concerned about the eventual evolution of supermethamphetamine. There's a lot of debate about how addictive contemporary addictive substances are. Conversely, I think it's very interesting from a moral enhancement point of view to see what the possible consequences of of technologies which fix addiction in the brain will be on our public debate about drug decriminalization and the treatment of drug addiction. Right now, the argument that someone has become enslaved because of their addiction seems to hold greater sway, but if we could actually make it so that someone is not disclaiming permanently from having damage to their opiate addiction or methamphetamine, I think it would change the debate quite significantly. So, and drug vaccines that block the efficacy of cocaine and so forth are part of that picture as well. And finally, inequality of access. We know from Michelle's work that unequal distribution of the capacity for self-control among children results in significant unequal lifetime capacities for educational opportunity and employment and so forth. So equalizing the access to, or at least a key treatment, diagnosis, medication, but in more generally to what these enhancement modalities could be in the future, so that people have greater capacities for self-control and moral self-direction, I think is going to be a very important question. And as I said, I would argue for a positive liberal model of good personality, and I don't have much to say more about that, but hopefully we can illuminate that question more today. So thank you very much.
So next we have Eric Kearns who's a senior research scholar at the Hastings Center, and he's one of the individuals who's at the forefront of investigating how we use new technologies to shape ourselves and how emergent science shape our self-understanding.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Well, the title of my talk, as you can see, is The Second Wave. Perhaps if one says something often enough, it will become true. I believe that we are in the midst of a second wave of the enhancement conversation or debate. And as I'm going to try to suggest to you, in this second wave, we're going to be talking about what enhancement is. As John Harris would say, what enhancement is worthy of the name, as opposed to being for or against enhancement. But before I try to spell out what I understand to be going on in this second wave, let me try to refresh the memories of those of you who perhaps are a little bit new to the enhancement debates. On my understanding, anyway, in the first wave, what we had was pitted against each other people with different people who proceeded to the debate from different moral intuitions. So we had people who were enthusiastic coming to the debate from an intuition about the goodness of enhancement and arguing for it. And some of the people who were most prominent among the enthusiasts were John Harris and Dave Hughes, who just spoke, and Julian Savulescu, and of course, many others. On the other side, the critics was a more diverse bunch. This is actually an interesting sociological point that I wish John Haidt and others would consider more carefully. Jay Hughes has actually been considering it for a long time. The critics have been a much more diverse group. It's included political conservatives and political liberals, as well as people who are secular and religious. So it's a bigger mix, but I'm thinking about people like Carl Elliott, Leon Kass, Michael Sandel. And my own moral intuitions are traditionally critical, by nature, nurture, iron, critical. Now, on my account of the first wave, what happens is you have these decent, smart people coming to talk, trying to win their point, and when the enthusiasts would try to make their case, they would give an account. Of course, they had to offer reasons. And one of the reasons they offered was that, look, to avail ourselves of new technologies to enhance ourselves is an expression of our deepest human nature. By nature, human beings are creators. Critics would come to the same conversation and say, look, by nature, human beings are creatures. We've been thrown into the world by powers we don't understand. It's our job as human beings to learn how to let things be, to simplify. When enthusiasts try to wage their argument, they say, look, nature is a mechanism that is engineerable. When critics come to make their argument, they say, look, nature is a fragile web. When enthusiasts make their argument for their initial intuition, they say, look, technology is a morally neutral means that we can put to whatever end we see fit. And with equal fervor and certainty, critics say, look, technology is a value-laden frame. It shapes our actions and our understanding of ourselves. Now, if I were clever about PowerPoint, I would try to show you, or suggest to you that we need this lens and this lens. If you want to understand, we need this lens and this lens, we need this lens and this lens. If we want to understand in depth, if we want to see in depth, surely we need binocularity. We need two lenses that pick out slightly different parts of the horizon, or so I believe. And I've been arguing for a little while now, for a few years now, that actually critics are not against true enhancement, and enthusiasts, as Jay was just telling us a second ago, aren't for, in different words, aren't for fake enhancements. So again, I've been trying to argue that we need to get over this four arguments to having a conversation about what true enhancement is, and it seems to me that that's actually what has already begun to happen in the context of moral enhancement, in the context of that debate. It seems to me that people like John Harris are already inviting us to ask the question, what is a moral enhancement, as he puts it, worthy of the name? By the way, it's very interesting. I know that there's some students of John Harris, or colleagues of John Harris, who disagree deeply with him about his views. I get that. I'm not, I am heartened by reading some of the things that he and Jay and others are saying in print. It seems to me that in this second wave, there are some very important things that critics absolutely must acknowledge, that people whose intuitions are critical. We have to acknowledge that the end, true moral enhancement, that end is in principle good, right? I mean, since Plato, philosophy has been for the sake of integrating the competing parts of the soul and on the Platonic account. If we have knowledge, we will be happy and act virtuously. This is a very ancient vision of us in the West, and in the East as well. Second, it seems to me that critics have to acknowledge that the biotechnological means are not, in principle, bad. Psychiatry today, and for a very long time, has also been for the sake of integrating the psyche's competing parts. Freud was a student of Plato in its own way. That is, psychiatry is for the sake of, among other things, facilitating our capacity to engage in moral behaviors. To take but one non-controversial example, when we treat depression with SSRI, the idea is to facilitate somebody's ability to engage in a variety of behaviors, including engaging, as Walter was saying yesterday, engaging in talk therapy or CBT. It's to facilitate our ability to act in the world, to be in relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the sorts of things that in the second wave, it seems to me, critics absolutely have to acknowledge. And what I want to talk about today is what I understand some of the enthusiasts to be doing. That is, I want to talk today about how I understand some enthusiasts to be advancing the conversation about moral enhancement, as opposed to just thumping forward it forth. So first I want to talk about John Harris's controversial work over the last few years. In particular, I want to talk about Harris's, remember John Harris is one of the war enthusiasts. One of the concerns that he has been articulating regarding some interventions that are being proposed to enhance moral behavior. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Harris's concern and others' concern regarding some biotechnological means of achieving moral enhancement. And finally, I'm going to be calling on a distinction that Julian Savulescu and Anders Sandberg made in an article that's been much discussed already, Pharmaceuticals, Love and Marriage. That's not exactly it. I'm going to be appealing to their distinction between maintaining and creating love. It seems to me that that distinction that they are grappling with in that paper is a distinction that can help us try to distinguish between, as it were, true and fake enhancements. So let me turn then first to this first concern about some interventions that promise but might not deliver moral enhancement. And here John Harris is, those are John Harris's words. He's paraphrasing someone he doesn't paraphrase a lot, God, I guess, or at least John Milton. Harris is here, says, sufficiency to stand is worthless without the freedom to fall. Now, this is, I suppose, one of the very simplest ideas any of us could possibly articulate, but I think it has resonance nonetheless. His claim is that for our lives to have worth, we have to be free to make them worthless. Tommaso, we can talk about what freedom means. Surely that's not an easy thing to do. It seems to me to suggest that freedom is an illusion, is a profoundly unhelpful simplification. But I think that what an important insight is at work when people say freedom is an illusion, but it's also can be a terrible simplification, I think. But what Harris is saying here is that for our lives to have value, we have to be free. And of course, I should mention that when critics go on about soma, pretty much what they're worried about is the loss of freedom. Indeed, I think, to begin with, in this second wave, we can notice that critics and enthusiasts agree that preserving freedom is awfully important. as Jay was just saying a moment ago. So what do we want freedom for? I put we in scare quotes so that you can ask me about, ask me the Kimusabi question, which is always an important question. Who is we? Kimusabi, always an important question. It is enormously dangerous to try to talk about what we want. Anybody who was around, alive, during postmodernism is aware of how dangerous trying to say what counts as freedom is. We can understand how dangerous that is. People like Derrida, Foucault, who haven't been mentioned at all. Foucault hasn't been mentioned at all. I mean, these are guys who taught us to worry about our epistemological hubris. It seems to me that just like it's important to try to say what we want, it's also enormously dangerous to fail to try to say what we want. People like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum and Isaiah Berlin and Jonathan Glover have been trying to say for a long time, if you want to stand up for people who are being treated badly, you have to be able to say something about what you understand people to want. Fundamentally, we want them to be free. I think that enthusiasts and critics can agree that we want to engage in activities as we really are. We're the kinds of animals that can want to act badly and we can want to act well, and we can act in accordance with that second-order desire, some of us sometimes. Indeed, John Harris says, and I'm quoting him here, forgive the ableist metaphor, he says, there is a difference between deliberately averting one's gaze or turning a blind eye or stopping one's ears to avoid doing evil and deliberately making oneself unable to see, unable to hear, unable to speak, and cognitively impaired to be incapable of doing evil. That is, we want to act well, but not at the cost of becoming a different sort of animal. We don't want to act well at the cost of becoming someone else. If we had time, this is where we would start talking about the moral ideal of authenticity, but we don't have time to do that now. I think enthusiasts and critics both not only want us to act in the world as we are, but we want to act with the world as it really is. Once again, John Harris talking here against strategies of oblivion, against making the unacceptable palatable with some drug. Here he is quoting this anti-war poet, Adrian Mitchell, who is essentially saying, look, you might want to turn away from the fact that in our world there is this war. You might want to stop up your ears and you want to stop up your mind with whiskey. But he's saying that's not at all what free people should be doing. So he certainly doesn't want an intervention that is going to separate us from the way the world is. Jay earlier was talking about his concerns, and I'm quoting him from 2004 from Citizen Cyborg. Jay was never a friend of Soma. He's saying here, look, imagine we can develop a drug that's 100% permanently addictive. The drug might rewrite the brain so that all the goals of value become secondary for being intoxicated. Suppressing or discouraging such a drug would be an exercise of coercion and defense of liberty, keeping people from selling themselves into slavery. That is, if you, well, I'll leave it at that. Clearly, neither Jay nor John Harris is a friend of Soma, a drug that would give us a sense of well-being in the absence of engaging in activities. Indeed, I don't think anybody wants Soma, and that's because the end that it aims at is bad. The end that it aims at is a kind of oblivion. It destroys our capacity to engage in meaningful activities. Moreover, I think most of us can agree, that an intervention that separated us from the way the world, from the way we really are, and from the way the world really is, would not be a true enhancement. It would not be an enhancement worthy of the name. So it's not that we're rejecting some of it. It is an enhancement we reject because it isn't a true enhancement. It isn't a real enhancement. So much more quickly to this second concern regarding some attempts at moral enhancement. Even if the end is good, we can certainly, and many of us do, have concerns about the unintended consequences of the biotechnological means. I'm summing up the concern here by saying that some of us worry that in deploying biotechnological means, we might inadvertently disrupt. I hope this is the only really pretentious phrase that I'm using here. We might interrupt the sort of ontological ecology. That is, we recognize that what's hardest and best about being human is inextricably entwined. I know that Walter does not have as modular a view of the mind, that nobody has as modular a view of the mind as we sometimes sounded as if we had yesterday. We all understand how distributed these functions are, and how inextricably entwined and complex, integrated the system is. But when people worry about the biotechnological means, I think one of the worries is that we will disrupt that ecology. Here, I divert to Hans Jonas, who is trying to capture, I won't read you the quote, but he is trying to capture the idea that tinkering with our being is an enormously tricky business to embark upon. What I have noticed is, and I'm sure all of you have looked at the literature, this concern about disrupting the ontological ecology is expressed all over the place. We've heard some of it already. John Harris is explicitly concerned that in our efforts to combat prejudice, we will inadvertently suppress our kin attachment, our capacity to love. People like Francis Fukuyama are concerned that in our attempts to reduce aggression, we will suppress our desire to act in ways that are worthy of recognition. People like Carl Elliott are worried that in our efforts to reduce bad forms of alienation, we will inadvertently reduce good forms. These are all examples of attempts to say that the biotechnological means might inadvertently undermine some capacities that we highly value. Now, if you will grant me that both critics and enthusiasts are worried about undermining freedom and are cognizant of and worried about the prospect of inadvertently disrupting the moral ecology, how then can we start trying to distinguish between enhancements that are and are not worthy of the name enhancement? And again, I want to appeal to some enthusiasts for help. And it does seem to me that Sobolescu and Sandberg are beginning to help in an important way in the essay I mentioned earlier. They're doing it in the context of one set of moral behaviors, love. That is, they give some examples, and this is, I think, the most salient for me. That they want to distinguish between a biotechnological means that could maintain a marriage, for example. That is, imagine there is a pill, oxytocin, that could facilitate the capacity to engage in marriage counseling. They want to endorse that kind of pill because it's going to facilitate engaging in certain kinds of activities that they value. They explicitly want to reject a biotechnological means that would, as it were, create love out of whole cloth. And if I had more time, I could have arranged this so that you would have had to choose who wrote the following quote. Was it the President's Council on Bioethics, or was it Julian Savulescu and Andrew Sandberg? They say the use of drugs to instill a new love, right, to create love out of whole cloth, is more likely to create inauthentic love, since the causal reasons for the love may lie in the drug rather than in the person loved. Right? So the idea is, sort of permanent ecstasy. You go to a party, as the President's Council put it, you take a drug, you have all the feelings normally associated with love without any of the activities that usually give rise to it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Savulescu et al. Are rejecting that pill, the one that would create love out of whole cloth. So why do we reject the pill to create love? Why are Julian and Andrews, and I think, I don't know, I'm not so good, but why? Well, I think we would reject that pill because it would separate us from who we are, from how the world is. I think that most of us want to engage in activities that make us worthy of being loved. We don't want to be loved on the basis of some kind of misapprehension. I think we want to love others who are worthy of being loved. If I discovered that my partner, who I thought was a great writer, is actually a plagiarist, that would be deeply disturbing. We want to freely choose whom to love. We don't want the drug to do the choosing. And I think we want to love others who freely choose to love us. And by the way, even David Levy, who was channeling Turing in Levy's book, Love and Sex with Robots, says, look, we don't want to be in love with a robot, even though, indeed, if we were desperate enough, we might settle for that. But even Levy said that isn't what we want. Why would we approve a pill to maintain love as opposed to the pill that would create it out of whole cloth? And I think the simple answer is that we think that, we have reasons to believe that the pill to maintain love would not separate us from who we really are and how the world really is. We would rather facilitate our engaging in meaningful activities. Activities from communicating with another to doing the sorts of things that we think are admirable and worthy of love. So, do I think that the distinction between creating and maintaining is a panacea, so to speak? Of course not. By the way, creating and maintaining is one way to put it. Engineering, facilitating is another way of putting it. Is it a panacea? There are many ways in which, of course, it is not. The very same substance can be used either to create or maintain ecstasy, I think, or oxytocin. Ecstasy could be used to promote counseling, or it could be taking sort of a steady drip, I suppose, could be a form of oblivion. There clearly is no bright line between interventions that create and interventions that maintain. There's necessarily going to be this zone of ambiguity where reasonable people are going to disagree. In sum, what I've tried to say is this. In the second wave of the enhancement debate, it seems to me that it's important to try to get over this for and against business and try and talk together about what true enhancement is and what the purposes mean. I think we can talk about what true moral enhancement is. And I think as we do that, it could help to remember a couple of things. One, that the biotech means aren't bad in principle. That biotech means are not bad in principle, though the concern about disrupting the ontological ecology is something that matters and is worth bearing in mind. It also seems to me that it's useful to remember that a true moral enhancement facilitates somebody's capacity to engage in moral behaviors as she is and as the world is. We have a long conversation about what that means. But an intervention that engineered somebody's capacity to behave well at the cost of her becoming somebody else would not be a true enhancement I'll give John Harris the last word. Moral enhancement, worthy of the name, needs to maintain its connection with the attempt to lead a good life oneself. Again, I don't imagine that unpacking that is easy, but I do think that's what we need to try to do together. So thank you very much.
Great. Next we have Joshua Do. He's a pioneer he's currently an associate professor in the program in cognitive science and Department of Philosophy at Yale University. He's also one of the leaders in this field. He basically started the field of experimental philosophy. And Josh.
So, demonstrate the kind of idea that can happen. So, you're looking around yourself, and you come upon a picture of Noam Chomsky. But you might be aware that Noam Chomsky has a body. It's not just a immaterial spirit. But at the same time, when you think about Noam Chomsky, you don't think about him in terms of his body. You don't think of him as a body. Rather, you think about his ideas in linguistics, in politics, in cognitive science, and for the most part, you're kind of going to be a big question about his body aside. Now, suppose you're looking around further, you come upon a picture of Megan Fox. In this case, you're putting up a very different kind of attitudes. It's not just that you know that it's a fact that Megan Fox has a body. It's that when you think about her, you're going to think about her in terms of her body. Her body is going to in some way be selling to her. You're going to see her as a body. What I want to understand today is the impact of this difference. What impact does it have on our way of understanding a person when we see that person as a body? So, I think there's a kind of traditional view of this question that goes something like this. It says, ordinary people are dualists. People think of a kind of real distinction between the mind on one hand and the body on the other. And now, insofar as we think about a person in terms of her mind, well, that's good. Insofar as we think about a person in terms of her mind, we're treating her with respect, we're treating her with dignity, we're treating her as a real human being. By contrast, insofar as we think about a person in terms of her body, well, that's bad. Insofar as we do that, we're robbing her of her dignity, we're not treating her as an autonomous individual, we're not treating her as a real human being, and so forth. So, if we want to enhance our morality, what we ought to do in this picture is ignoring people's bodies, not thinking of them as bodies at all, but rather thinking about them in terms of their minds. I think there's something very compelling about this picture. Today, we can argue that there's a growing body of evidence suggesting things are actually more complex. So the outline is going to proceed roughly like this. First, I'm going to provide a kind of general framework for thinking about the relationship between mind and body, so how it is that ordinary people understand this relationship between mind and body. And then following that, we're going to apply this to the specific case of body science. We're going to report some experimental studies that look at the impact of seeing someone as a body on the way you think about them as a mind. So let's begin with the general framework. Here, we just want to understand how it is in general that people think about other people's minds. I think there's a picture here that is going to seem initially very intuitive, but it's really going to grasp people. The picture goes something like this. Suppose you are looking at a picture of Chomsky, then you immediately recognize that Chomsky has a mind. And then, because you recognize that Chomsky has a mind, you're going to think of him as having all sorts of different kinds of psychological states. So you're going to recognize that Chomsky is capable of having beliefs, of having intentions, pains, joys, and a whole multifarious array of other kinds of psychological states that people can have. By contrast, suppose you came upon something else, like say a toaster. When you see a toaster, it doesn't have any of those properties that trigger this process of mind attribution. So you're not going to think of the toaster as having any of these kinds of psychological states. So you're going to think, this toaster is not capable of beliefs, nor intentions, nor pains, nor joys, nothing. It doesn't have any psychological states of any kind. Now, finally, suppose you consider a person, but a person whose body is made extremely silent. In that case, you might think, you're going to use something that's intermediate between the two pieces that we just saw. So on some level, you're going to be recognizing that she has a mind. But at the same time, you're going to be seeing her less as having a mind. So you're going to recognize that she's capable of having beliefs, passions, pains, and joys, and so forth. But there's going to be a tendency on her part to disregard those states and to think of her more in terms of her body nature. If you think that that's right, you're subscribing to a theory that's like the traditional theory of objectification. What it says is that when you think of someone in terms of her body, you're thinking of her more as like a mere object, just a mere thing. You're neglecting some important thing in her mind. I think there's something really compelling on an intuitive level about this picture. It's a picture that's really grabbed people in many cases over many decades. At the same time, I think there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that this picture is really deeply wrong. It's not the right way of understanding this phenomenon. And in particular, what seems to be mistaken about it is just the very idea that there is a psychological process like this one a psychological process whereby we determine whether a person has a mind. So instead, what recent psychological evidence seems to indicate is that there are really two distinct processes. On the one hand, there's a process whereby we determine whether people are capable of having beliefs, intentions, and ability to reason, to think, to calculate, to plan, to engage in self-control. And then there's another psychological process which does something quite different. This other psychological process seems to enable people to determine whether someone is capable of feeling pain, joy, experiencing love, feeling excited, getting upset, and so forth. A process that determines whether someone is capable of having states that have involved feelings. So a whole variety of different cognitive scientists working on these kinds of problems independently arrived at this kind of formulation. And each of them gave these two different processes different names. But when we were trying to develop this idea, borrowed certain terms from the philosophical literature. So we called these intentional states, and then we refer to these as phenomenal states. So, of course, it doesn't really matter what names you give to these different processes. What matters is that they're distinct, so that you can look upon a given kind of entity, and you can think that it has the intentional states, but doesn't have the phenomenal states, or conversely, you can look at an entity and see it as having a lot of the phenomenal states, but not the intentional states. So if we need to think of things in this way, you arrive at a very different way of formulating our initial question. There's no single question, what effect does seeing something as embodied have on whether you see it as a mind? Rather, there are two distinct questions. There's a question, what impact does seeing someone in terms of her body or seeing something as embodied have on attribution of intentional states? And then separately from that, a question, what impact does seeing something in terms of its body have on attribution of phenomenal states? So what we want to suggest now is that it might very well be true that seeing something in its body decreases your tendency to think of it as having intentional states. But we want to suggest it actually increases your tendency to regard that thing as having phenomenal states. In other words, that there's a special link between embodiment and phenomenality, such that the more you understand a person in terms of her body, the more you're going to be able to see that person as having states with this phenomenal character, states that involve many feelings. So ultimately, I want to explore this in the domain of body studies. But first, I just want to provide some initial evidence in favor of this kind of general framework. This idea that there's this special link between attribution of embodiment and attribution of phenomenality. And here I'm going to be talking about some work I did in partnership with my former colleague, Jesse Prince. So the basic approach we adopted is this. We thought, if there really is this special link, then if we define an entity that's not seen as having a body, it should be the case that that entity will not be seen as having phenomenal states. So what we need to define now is an entity that's kind of like a human being in many ways, but that differs from a human being in the sense that it's not a body, it's sort of disembodied being. So the entity that we came up with was a corporation, like say Goldman Sachs. So we want to understand now, what kind of psychological states do people see corporations as being capable of? Do people see corporations as being capable of having intentional states? And do people see corporations as being capable of having phenomenal states? So we conducted a whole series of experiments to address this question. Here, I'm not going to be talking in detail about these experimental studies, but I just want to give you, as a kind of demonstration, a sense for the basic effect. So let's look at some attributions of intentional states to Goldman Sachs corporations and see whether they seem okay to you. So what do people think about the first one? How many people think it sounds right to say Goldman Sachs corporation believes that its profit margin will soon increase? Now, how many people think it sounds right to say Goldman Sachs corporation intends to release a new product this January? Okay, so far things are looking pretty good for the intentional states. Now let's switch to the phenomenal states. How many people think it sounds okay to say Goldman Sachs corporation is now experiencing great joy? How many people think it sounds right to say Goldman Sachs corporation is getting the best? So what we saw across a whole series of experiments in exploring these phenomena is that people were willing to ascribe just about any kind of intentional state to a corporation, but that people rejected descriptions of just about any kind of phenomenal state to a corporation. So within the experimental philosophy literature, this kind of claim became a very controversial one. There were a whole series of studies trying to follow up on it in various ways and investigate further why this was happening and what significance it might have. So here, I'm not going to talk about that debate in great detail. I just want to give you a few highlights to give you a sense of what kind of work people have been doing on this topic. So first, we decided to conduct a neuroimaging study in which we looked at which brain regions are showing activation when people consider the attribution of psychological states to entities like corporations. So when we hear a sentence like, Goldman Sachs intends to release a new product in January, which regions within your brain are showing activation? what we find is that it's the very same regions are showing activation in that case as when we just say that MAC-UL was to intend to release the product of July. So, for example, the right temporal parietal function here is showing activation in both of those circumstances. So, what this seems to be indicating is providing at least some initial evidence that it's not just when we use these words that say can or believe, to talk about corporations as well as individuals, but that in addition, that very same psychological process that we use in order to think about other people as having psychological states is the same one we use in order to think about, say, a corporation having psychological states. Second, our team of experimental philosophers was concerned with the problem that John Haidt mentioned yesterday, that maybe this effect that we're seeing is just due to certain idiosyncratic features of our own American culture. We wanted to know, is this going to actually replicate cross-culturally? So what they did was to conduct the same sort of study, only this time in Hong Kong. What they found is that the exact same effect occurred, only with a smaller effect size. That is to say, people in Hong Kong also think that corporations can have intentional states, but not phenomenal states. However, the difference between the intentional and phenomenal is smaller among the Hong Kong residents than it is in the Western culture. And one concern we might have about these studies based on corporations is that it might be that corporations can be seen as having intentional states, but not phenomenal states. Yet at the same time, one might worry, maybe the reason for that is not because corporations are these disembodied beings. Rather, maybe the reason for that has to do with some other facts about corporations. For example, the fact that corporations seem so relentlessly to be seeking profits. So, to get around this problem, experimental philosophers sought to look at various other kinds of disembodied agents and see if the very same effect would occur in those other cases as well. So, for example, there were a whole series of studies looking at people's intuitions about robots, and what those studies seem to be showing is precisely the same effect. So, just like corporations, robots are seen as being capable of believing things, intending things, knowing things, planning things, calculating, and so forth. Yet, if you ask, can a robot truly feel happy? Can a robot feel pain? Can a robot get depressed? People are saying no. So let's sum up the argument so far. We saw that there are these two different kinds of states, intentional states and phenomenal states. Then we looked at a collection of different kinds of entities that don't have bodies, so disembodied entities. And we see for all of these disembodied entities, there's a willingness to attribute intentional states, but an unwillingness to attribute phenomenal states. So what this seems to be providing some initial evidence for is the idea that embodiment is some sort of key cue to the attribution of phenomenality. Of course, this claim remains very controversial in the experimental philosophy literature. A number of different papers going back and forth, exploring in real detail how people use these senses and so forth. But we're at least getting some initial kind of evidence for this claim. So now what we want to do is apply this kind of general framework to the issue of body science. And here, I'm going to be talking about some work that we did in collaboration with Kurt Gray, who is the sort of lead author and the main force behind these studies, Mark Cheskin, Paul Bloom, from whom we heard yesterday, and Lisa Falkenberg. So the basic idea we had was to just look at the converse of the kind of case that we saw in the domain of robots and corporations. So suppose we look at something that is seen more as being embodied, then we might predict that that might potentially lead to less attribution of intentional states, but it should actually lead to a greater attribution of phenomenal states. So we want to do this, we need to come up with an entity that is exactly the opposite of something like a corporation or a robot. We need to find an entity that's actually seen as having more of a body than, say, you folks around here or that I do. So to do this, we began by randomly sending people to one of two conditions, which they would receive pictures that looked either like this or like this. So, for instance, in one condition, we see pictures of people whose bodies are made very low in science, and the participants in the other condition are receiving pictures of people whose bodies are made very high in science. And within each condition, participants are just asked about the attribution of different kinds of psychological states. So on one hand, they're asked about the degree to which these people are capable of planning, of self-control, of acting morally, and having other kinds of intentional states. Then on the other hand, they're asked about the degree to which these people are capable of experiencing pleasure, experiencing hunger, experiencing desire, having these other kinds of phenomenal states. So I should emphasize that in the actual study, these different kinds of states are all sort of jumbled together in the order of questions sort of counted on. So now we can look for each of these two groups, the lower science group, and the degree to which the states have intentional states and the degree to which the states have phenomenal states. If you look at the attribution of intentional states, what you find is just exactly what would be predicted by those traditional theories involving objectification. So people are saying that the person who is body made high in science is less capable of self-control, less capable of moral action, less capable of planning. Exactly what you would picture on this kind of very traditional theories. But now, suppose we switch over to the phenomenal states. What we find there is exactly the opposite pattern. When people's bodies are being higher in science, people are actually attributing phenomenal states to those people to a greater degree. In other words, when you make a person's body higher in salience, it's not as though you just show a uniform decrease in your tendency to think of the person as having a mind. Rather, what you show is a decrease in the tendency to think of them as having a certain part of the mind, but an increase in the tendency to think of them as having another part of the mind. So following this initial study, we wanted to see whether we could take this further and look at an actual centralized depiction of another person. So, for instance, in the second study, we're assigned to one of three conditions. So participants could be shown either a person whose body is made very low in science, a person whose body is made much higher in science, or just a full-on pornographic image of another person. So in the pictures that I'm showing you here, the images, parts of the images are sort of obscure for the sake of propriety, but in the actual images shown to subjects, they are not. So then, once again, participants were asked questions about the degree to which each of the people depicted has various kinds of intentional states, and the degree to which these people have various kinds of nominal states. And we now can look at the pattern of attribution of these different kinds of states across our three conditions. If we look now at the pattern of attribution within the intentional states, we find this beautiful example of exactly what we predicted by these traditional theories involving objectification. So what we see is that as you go from low body science, high body science, to a sexualized depiction, you get a stepwise, gradual decrease in the attribution of intentional states. The more you take off your clothes, the more you will appear in a pornographic image, the less you're going to be seen as being capable of reasoning, planning, self-control, exactly what you might think. Now, suppose we look at the attribution of phenomenal states. First of all, we replicate the original effect, whereby if you go from a case in which the body is being low in science to high in science, you're increasing the attribution of these states. And then, if you continue from the case in which it's high science to centralized, we face a question. What is going to happen in that case? When we go from just making the body salient to actually showing a pornographic image, will we now show a decrease in the attribution of the capacity to have real feelings? Or will it continue to increase? And the answer is, it just continues to increase. So, if you consider now the difference between someone being depicted in a pornographic image and someone with their clothes on, the person depicted in a pornographic image is actually being seen as more capable of feeling pain, more capable of feeling fear, and just overall more capable of having certain kinds of feelings. So, if we continue now to the summary of what basically we're finding here, it seems like there's this traditional view that said there's this certain kind of psychological process, it's the process of attributing a mind, and now a question arises, what happens when you think of a person in terms of her body? What impact does that have on the attribution of mind? What we're seeming to find now is that that whole question just doesn't exist. There is no psychological process that's kind of called the attribution of mind. So there is no question as to what impact seeing someone as having a body has on the process. Instead, what it seems like is that there are two distinct processes: a process for attributing intentional states, a process for attributing phenomenal states, and then there are distinct questions as to what impact seeing someone as a body has on each of these processes. What seems to be happening is that seeing someone as a body decreases your sense that that person has intentional states, but actually increases your sense that that person has phenomenal states. So perhaps it's a mistake to think in terms of this old metaphor of objectification. What you're doing in this case is not seeing the person as something like a physical object, like a toaster. Rather, you might call it animalization. What you're doing is seeing the person more like a non-human animal, as having less of those kinds of psychological states that are distinctively human, but as having more of those kinds of psychological states that are shared between us and other animals. So if we return now to our original example, I think we can see that the pattern of data suggests that something more complex is happening than we might initially have expected. So it's true that when you consider someone's body to be extremely salient, there are certain really worrying and very disturbing aspects of the way that our cognition works in those cases. We seem to be denying to those people certain really distinctively human and deeply important capacities. For example, the capacity to plan, to reason, to act morally, to exert self-control, and so forth. But the picture is not so simple. If you look at people, people who are not seen at all in terms of their body, you see an opposing sort of pattern of neglect. That in those kind of cases, what ends up happening is that we think of the person as being capable of these intentional states, capable of complex hallucination, reasoning, planning, and so forth, but that we might often neglect in certain cases to notice what that person is feeling. To actually ask ourselves, is that person upset? Is that person afraid? And to the extent that we begin to think of that person as having a body, we can sort of recognize that other, also very important aspect of their humanity. Thanks.
Finally, we have Anna Bukowski. She's a doctoral student in the Institute for Science and Ethics and Innovation at the School of Law at the University of Manchester. And her research is supported by the Wellcome Trust strategic program, The Human Body, Its Scope, Limits, and Future.
It's such a pleasure to be here. We just had 2 wonderful days to reflect on the developments of neuroscience and what they might bring us. I will use the little time I have to tie in some threads that emerged in the discussion already, and perhaps provide a little bit of a take on the issue. Some of the issues I was going to discuss have been already raised, so the presentation more slightly, I hope you will learn with me. So as you know, I'm from Manchester, England, and I will be making 3 points, hopefully for sure, 3 the time allows, but they will be tied by one particular thread, which is minding the gap. And yes, I don't necessarily mean minding the gap between the train and the platform. I mean minding the gap between how we understand, intuitively speaking, moral enhancement. So understanding is as making people moral better in some way, perhaps with reference to moral agency. And minding the gap between that and what neuroscience, what kind of tools, new tools can it offer us. And so I'll start really with the game plan. So I'll be talking about the social and the moral, and the importance of minding the gap and minding the language. And then maybe a little bit about moral disagreement and some perhaps surprising conclusions we may come to. And then I would suggest, if we have enough time, that maybe we should be talking about moral modification, just to start with talking about concrete cases rather than making generalizations. So what's meditation is the complex sensibility and the difference between the moral and the social, which have already been raised before. In the current literature, the examples of moral enhancement included enhancing empathy, trust, and other traits that may translate into dispositions for social behavior, and reducing antisocial behavior. However, many have pointed out, also during this conference, that prosocial does not equal moral, and antisocial does not equal immoral. Enhancing prosociality, empathy, or helping behavior is simply not enough for behavior to be moral, and increasing general empathy may even lead to a disproportionate increase in empathy for the suffering of the in-group. If this is perceived to be inflated by the out-group, it can even stimulate the increased hatred, and there's a number of similar examples. So we have to be careful not to make sometimes tempting generalizations. I would like to take this idea of context sensitivity and the difference a little bit further. If we agree that context is important, we might be left with evaluating intervention, if not case by case basis, then at least group into kinds and look at the kind of populations we may want to apply certain intervention to. There have been some questions during the discussion, during the panel, for example, that pointed in this direction, asking, for example, what kind of interventions could be used in specific populations to lead to a behavior more conducive to the good. So all things considered more relative outcomes or behavior that's general relative in some sense. So that idea, for example, might be that those in the current profession do a much better job after an increase in empathy. But of course, more insights are there because we have seen the research that shows that doctors, those who suffer from less burnout than others, tend to be less sensitive to pain of their patients. And that change is on very, very early perception of pain levels, early in the processing stage. And so we can think about analogical issues with modulation of anger. The way anger is displayed is modulated by a set of cognitive processes, and this mediation is complex. To illustrate that point, let us consider some of the recent research on conflict resolution. Halperin, for example, conducted a study at the eve of the Annapolis Peace Summit in 2007 and found that above and beyond any other emotion, the construct rather as sentimental hatred increased the tendency of Israelis to support extreme military action for Palestinians. And researchers suggest that the level of long-term hatred influences the behavior and manifestation of anger, which seems intuitive. But also pointed out towards the possible pro-social influence of anger. So, in absence of hatred, the absence of anger created a tendency to engage in constructive problem solving and crisis management instead of the violent reaction. So just another example of how complex those issues can get. Moreover, it is not only that we may get it wrong as in terms of what kind of effects the kind of intervention we are proposing will lead to. It's also that the notion of prosociality itself is rather ambiguous. How do we use the concept of prosociality then? Well, firstly, it may be understood as acting in a certain way. We can refer to certain characteristics of actions, being kind, generous, compassionate, or sympathetic. And so when we can just talk about nice people. We can talk about this kind of behavior dispositions that we have in mind when we talk about nice people. On the other hand, it may also be understood, the concept also can be understood in reference to making a society which somehow functions more smoothly. So being a grease in the cogs of the machine. But the rather obvious point here is that a well-functioning society might, at least in principle, be full of people who are rather nasty. They are not nice, not altruistic, not generous, and so not prosocial in that sense. Yet the mixing of these two senses, it seems like it is quite a trivial point, but the mixing of two senses is very obvious in the discourse surrounding social personality disorder, psychopathy. And then another question is whether we want our society to function smoothly and efficiently at all, or whether a degree of dissonance, conflict, and waste is conducive to change and creative exploring of our collective fate. And I think that idea resonates in quite a lot of literature on the creative dimension of conflict. And that has a great issue is whether what is considered antisocial is indeed immoral. This person might probably have you seen that at work? Yes. We probably agree. So emotions like anger may lead to violence, but may also modulate the perception of unfairness, as was mentioned before, and maybe involved in actions that are motivated by moral concern. So it's not anger and hatred that's problematic. And I think those people took the point of pinch points rather seriously. And this is like Valenza, who got very, very angry, jumped at the wall in the right moment, and then received the Nobel Peace Prize. So we are talking about social change that anger may be quite a useful thing. But why are those distinctions important at all? I think that the importance can be clearly seen when we talk about perhaps quite a mythical figure of the psychopath. Not only the psychopath lacks prosociality in the sense of having empathy and sympathy, like, well, us, nice folks, but their behavior might be thought of as being antisocial in the second sense as well. Moreover, their behavior might be thought as going against what is moral. When we think about psychopathy, the prototype we might imagine might have committed horrendous crimes. They're troubling not only because they go against the smooth functioning of the society, but because they inflict harm. Those acts are immoral because of the harm inflicted, not because the antisociality of it. So ranking the prosocial traits as moral, discussing the increase in those typically prosocial traits under the heading of moral enhancement, is especially worrying here given the real-world context of our discussion. So in recent years, the convergence of the criminal justice system and mental health system in the UK, for example, means that pharmacological and other psychiatric interventions are easier to deliver to offenders. And also the recent focus on the management of so-called dangerous individuals in the UK, as well as the history of the public health perspective on violence in the US. Some might see the time to be ripening for biological interventions. It certainly sounds better to run the intervention as a moral enhancement rather than enhancing prosocial disposition. It's easier to sell. And quite a lot of conflation of this kind you can see also in the press coverage of these issues. If you look at recent Guardian notice, talking about the developments with science and morality, well, those conflations are really dreadful, with a couple of sentences at the end. This research will have tremendous implications for making psychology better. So that's the first one. Let's make it up. Secondly, I would like to talk about moral disagreement. So some may doubt the plausibility of moral enhancement, or even doubt the reasonableness of pursuing it, based on the claim that there is substantial and possibly irreconcilable disagreement as to what is the right moral thing to do about things. If we disagree about what is moral, the argument will go. We have no way of knowing how we should modify our moral sphere. We don't even know what the goal of the modification should be. There is at least one understanding of moral enhancement to which this doubt does not apply, and we have to to that. Being moral is so if we have a closer look, although there's quite a lot of disagreement as to what moral education should look like. For example, most of us would not say that for that reason it's better not to teach our kids any kind of reactions or moral point of view. Well, why is that? First, because despite possible theoretical differences, there is a good amount of consensus about which acts or kinds of acts are morally wrong and which are moral right. So objections from disagreement will not apply to improving our ability to be moral in those cases. The presence of disagreement is often used to demonstrate the inadequacy of moral realism and to justify certain conclusions about the metaphysics of morals. But what I'm interested in here is the epistemological argument. And so I would like to talk a little bit about disagreement and the effects of it as pertaining to moral knowledge. And so first maybe I would like to start with Sidgwick's quote from Methods of Ethics. If I find any of my judgments, intuitive or inferential, in direct conflict with a judgment of some other mind, there must be error somewhere. And if I have no more reason to suspect error in the other mind than in my own, reflective comparison between the two judgments necessarily reduces me to temporarily to a state of neutrality. So McGrath develops a parallel argument that applies not to certainty but rather to moral knowledge. When moral beliefs are subject to disagreement and Sidgwick conditions satisfied, one is not holding knowledge about the contested issue, and that is the case even if the belief happens to be true. In fact, McGrath develops a stronger version of this claim, arguing that all controversial moral issues fulfills Sigmund's condition. And let us accept that claim just for the purpose of the argument. So what consequences would that kind of concept for the moral consent project? Well, the consequences are far from straightforward. And so, in those cases, it does not follow that we should abandon cognitive or find moral enhancement and untenable proposition. And that applies both to moral education and to other non-traditional means of enhancement. First, in cases that apparently satisfy Sigmund's condition, we may still have some problems justifying why exactly it's rational for us to trust others' moral intuitions as much as we trust our own, and why, as a consequence, we should abandon our beliefs. But let us put that issue aside and assume that some version of Sigmund's proposals to how to deal with those doubts actually applies. And so, in many cases of controversy, it's rational for us to abandon our beliefs. So, most traditional moral enhancement is unlikely to be specific enough to change the moral appraisals of any particular controversial issue. It's more likely to slightly modify some propensities to react, perceive, and behave by increasing impulse control, empathy, trust, reducing fear, responsiveness, and so on and so forth. So, naturally, we can still disagree about issues such as whether a higher level of trust is conducive to moral outcomes in a given context. Even if they accept the context specificity and the importance of that. However, if we accept Sigmund's advice to hold our judgments, we are still with the question, left with the question, what we should do next. So let's say that we disagree, and fundamentally disagree, about whether Jane should increase, decrease, or maintain her empathetic ability. So we fundamentally disagree about all three possibilities. What behavior would constitute holding our judgments on this issue? Some may say that we should leave things as they are. But there is no reason why we should privilege the status quo option over other possibilities, given that there is a disagreement also about the status quo. So, moral disagreement is problematic as justification for leaving things as they are. So we are still left with the question, what we should do next? The answer could be that it is only rational for us to have no moral views at all on the contentious matter and use other reasons to decide on the course of action. It is important to remember that we have developed political means of dealing with moral disagreement and sometimes find disagreement to be constructive force necessary to change. In liberal societies, moral education is often about developing the ability of reasoning, of people to be autonomous moral agents, providing them with the possibility of gaining reasoning skills and exposure to moral problems to aid this development. We tend to protect the freedom of people to disagree. With commonly held views, we also have political frameworks that aid us in dealing with moral disagreement in the case when we want to set up the policy. Even given doubts that an agent may have about what he or she ought to do, we are likely to find the adoption of a moral stance, for example, as opposed to narrow self-interested stance, to be valuable. One could argue that the possibility of moral enhancement is a liberal framework would likely to deepen disagreement, which could be seen as not a good thing, potentially even morally speaking. We may therefore have good reasons to make people less bothered about morality in cases where a disagreement arises. This would be solution consistent with the view that it is rational for us to abandon our beliefs in certain cases of disagreement. Interestingly, this argument for making people suspend their judgment and refrain from following moral reasons under these particular circumstances is an argument for a certain kind of enhancement. If one supported this argument using moral reasons, this would be an argument for a specific kind of moral enhancement, understood as making people, well, more better. If the rationale is potential, we have a case for potentially beneficial intervention in our moral sphere. So, to sum up, moral disagreement has much less straightforward consequences for the project of changing the way we function morally and making changes for the moral sphere that it seems on the first side. How much time do we have? Okay.